I'm 52 years old now, and for 20 years I've kept the most terrifying secret of my life locked inside me. Some of you will call me crazy. Others will say I'm looking for attention, that I'm making this up for views or money. But I don't care anymore. I can't carry this weight alone any longer. What happened to me in the Cascade Mountains in October 2004 changed everything I thought I knew about the world, about nature, and about what's really out there in those remote forests where most people never dare to go. My name is David Brennan. I was a professional downhill mountain biker back then, sponsored by a major bike company, traveling across the Pacific Northwest, chasing the most extreme trails I could find. I lived for that rush, that feeling of flying down a mountain at 50 miles per hour, trees blurring past me, rocks and roots trying to throw me off my line. I was good at it too. Top 15 in national rankings, featured in magazines, the whole deal. October 2004 was supposed to be my breakthrough season. I had just placed third in a major competition in British Columbia, and my sponsor wanted fresh content, raw footage of me riding the gnarliest terrain imaginable. That's what brought me to the Cascade Mountains in Washington State, specifically to a remote area near Mount Baker that locals had been telling me about for months. The trail was called Devil's Spine. Stupid name, I thought back then. Now I understand why they called it that. It was a Thursday morning, October 14th, 2004. The sky was that particular shade of grey that's common in the Pacific Northwest during fall. Heavy clouds threatening rain, but never quite delivering. The air smelled like wet pine needles and moss, that rich, earthy scent that fills your lungs when you're deep in old-growth forest. I had driven up alone in my beat-up Ford pickup, bike loaded in the back, camera gear stuffed in waterproof bags. The trailhead was about 40 miles from the nearest town, accessed by a logging road that hadn't been maintained in years. My truck bounced and scraped over ruts and fallen branches for the last 5 miles. No cell service out there, obviously. The radio had cut out about 30 minutes before I reached the parking area. Just static and occasional bursts of some religious station from who knows where. I parked in a small clearing where 2 other vehicles sat, both covered in a thin layer of dirt and pine needles. They looked like they'd been there for days, maybe weeks. A rusted Jeep with flat tires and a Subaru with moss growing on the roof. Abandoned, I figured. People leave cars in the mountains all the time, break down or run out of gas and just walk out. The trail itself started innocent enough. Wide, well-packed dirt, gentle descent through thick forest. Douglas firs towered above me, some of them probably 200 feet tall, their trunks wider than my truck. Ferns covered the ground in every direction, creating that prehistoric feeling you get in the deep northwest woods. Sword ferns mostly, their fronds still green despite it being mid-October. I spent about 20 minutes doing a reconnaissance run, walking the first mile of the trail with my bike, checking the line, looking for the big features I'd want to hit on camera. The trail got progressively steeper and more technical. Massive root sections, rock gardens, a few small drops. Perfect. Exactly what I needed. By 10:30 a.m., I was ready to shoot. I set up my camera rig on my helmet, checked the battery, made sure everything was secure. Then I hiked back up to the top section, probably a quarter-mile climb that left me breathing hard in the thin mountain air. That's when I first noticed the silence. I'm not talking about normal quiet. I mean complete, absolute silence. No birds, no squirrels chattering, no wind moving through the trees, nothing. In 15 years of riding in forests across 3 countries, I'd never experienced silence like that. It felt wrong, like the forest was holding its breath. I should have left right then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to pack up my gear, get on my bike and ride straight back to my truck. But I didn't. I was focused on the shot, on the footage, on my career. I told myself the silence was just a weather thing, that animals get quiet before storms. I dropped in. The first 30 seconds were perfect. Speed building, bike floating over roots, tires gripping perfectly on the damp dirt. I hit a small drop and landed clean, the suspension soaking up the impact exactly like it should. My camera was recording, I was in the zone, and this was going to be the footage that would make my sponsor happy. Then I saw the first track. I was doing maybe 35 miles per hour when my front tire passed over it, and my brain registered what I'd seen about 2 seconds later. I squeezed my brakes hard, the rear tire skidding in the dirt, and came to a stop about 20 feet past the mark. I got off my bike and walked back. The track was massive. I'm talking about a footprint that measured at least 18 inches long and 7 inches wide, pressed deep into the soft dirt beside the trail. 5 distinct toe impressions, no claw marks. The depth of the print suggested something incredibly heavy. It made it far heavier than any bear or elk. My hands started shaking as I pulled out my phone to take a picture, then remembered I had no service. I used my helmet camera instead, kneeling down beside the print, putting my hand next to it for scale. My hand looked like a child's toy in comparison. The print was fresh. I could tell because the edges were still crisp, not eroded by rain or wind. Whatever made this had been here recently, maybe hours ago, maybe minutes. I stood up slowly, suddenly very aware of how isolated I was. 40 miles from town, no cell service, no one knew exactly where I was. My girlfriend knew I was somewhere in the Cascades, but that covered about 10,000 square miles. The silence was even more pronounced now. The forest felt like it was watching me. I should have walked my bike back to the truck right then, but I didn't. Instead, I told myself it was probably just a deformed bear print, or maybe someone playing a prank, making fake Bigfoot tracks for hikers to find. People did that kind of thing all the time. I got back on my bike. If you're still with me on this story and feeling that chill down your spine, subscribe to the channel now. It helps us bring more accounts like this that you won't see on the news. And tell me in the comments, do you think I should have turned back right there? Or would you have kept going? Let me tell you a bit more about who I was back then, because it matters for understanding why I made the choices I did that day. I'd been riding professionally for 8 years by 2004, started when I was 24, right after dropping out of college, where I'd been studying engineering. My parents were furious, said I was throwing away my future for a hobby that would leave me broken and poor by the time I was 35. They weren't entirely wrong, but they weren't entirely right either. Downhill mountain biking wasn't just a sport for me. It was meditation, therapy, and pure adrenaline, all mixed together. When you're riding at speed down a technical trail, there's no room for anything else in your mind. No anxiety about money, no worries about relationships, no existential dread about where your life is going. Just the trail, your bike, and the split-second decisions that keep you upright and moving forward. I'd ridden in some pretty remote places by then. British Columbia backcountry, mountain ranges in Montana, isolated trails in Northern California. I was comfortable being alone in the wilderness. More comfortable, honestly, than being in cities or around large groups of people. The Cascade Mountains had always been special to me. There's something about those forests that feels ancient, untouched. Old-growth trees that were standing when Columbus reached America. Ecosystems that have functioned the same way for thousands of years, and a darkness under the canopy that's both beautiful and unsettling. I'd heard stories, of course. The Pacific Northwest is ground zero for Bigfoot sightings, and every logger, hiker, and ranger up there has either a story of their own or knows someone who does. I'd always dismissed them as campfire tallies, misidentified bears, or attention-seeking nonsense. I was a rational guy, believed in what I could see and measure and prove. That October day in 2004 was already strange before I found the footprint. The drive-up had been normal enough, but when I was loading my gear at the trailhead, I'd noticed something odd. Scratches on one of the trees near where I parked, deep gouges in the bark running vertically about 8 feet off the ground. Too high for a bear standing on its hind legs, and the pattern was wrong anyway. 4 parallel marks, like fingers. I'd photographed them with my digital camera, thinking they were interesting but not particularly concerning. The tree was a big Douglas fir, bark probably 4 inches thick, and whatever made those marks had carved through it like it was butter. Then there was the smell. About halfway through my initial reconnaissance walk, I'd caught a whiff of something pungent and organic. Not dead animal, not human, not anything I could immediately identify. It reminded me a bit of a wet dog mixed with something musky, almost skunky, but not quite. It was strong enough that I'd stopped and looked around, trying to locate the source, but couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. After a minute or two, the breeze shifted and the smell disappeared. I'd noticed other small things too. A tree snapped about 12 feet off the ground, the trunk about 6 inches in diameter, just broken clean off and lying across the trail. No saw marks, no axe marks, just snapped. I'd moved it aside to clear my riding line and thought maybe lightning had hit it, though the break looked wrong for that. There were no bird sounds anywhere. I mentioned the silence before, but even during my initial walk, when I was first getting my bearings on the trail, I didn't hear a single bird call. No ravens croaking, no jays squawking, no woodpeckers hammering. Nothing. The Pacific Northwest forests are usually alive with sound. Even on quiet days, there's always something moving, calling, living. But that day, it was like the forest had been evacuated. After I'd found the massive footprint and tried to rationalize it away, I continued riding. The trail got steeper, more technical. I was hitting 40 miles per hour on some sections, barely in control, which was exactly the feeling I wanted. The footage was going to be incredible. Then I found the second print. This one was even clearer than the first. Same size, same shape, but this time there were 2 of them. A left foot and a right foot, stride probably 6 feet apart, both pressed deep into the mud beside a stream crossing. I stopped again, got off my bike again, stared at them for a long time. The prints were positioned in a way that suggested whatever made them had been walking slowly, carefully. Not running, not charging, just walking. And the direction they were heading was parallel to the trail I was riding, about 20 feet off to the right in the thick brush. I looked into the forest in that direction. The underbrush was dense, salal, and Oregon grape and sword ferns, creating a nearly impenetrable wall of green. Visibility maybe 15 feet before everything blurred into shadows and vegetation. Something could be standing 30 feet from me, and I wouldn't see it. That's when I heard the sound. It started as a low rumble, almost subsonic, something you feel in your chest as much as hear with your ears. Then it rose in pitch, becoming a vocalization that I can only describe as a howl mixed with a roar. It lasted maybe 5 seconds and came from somewhere deep in the forest to my right, the same direction the footprints were heading. Every hair on my body stood up. I'd heard bear vocalizations before, elk bugles, mountain lion screams. This was none of those things. This was something else entirely. Something that sounded angry, or territorial, or warning me to leave. My bike lay on the ground where I'd dropped it. My helmet camera was still recording, capturing my rapid breathing and the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. The forest went silent again. Even more silent than before, if that was possible. I made a decision in that moment, a decision that I've regretted for 20 years. I got back on my bike and I started riding downhill, fast. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to turn round, hike back up to the trailhead, get in my truck, and drive away as fast as possible. But the irrational part, the part that had made me drop out of college to chase adrenaline down mountainsides, that part said something different. That part said, "You're on a bike, you're fast." Whatever made those sounds is in the forest, off the trail. You can outrun it. Just point your bike downhill and go. So I went. The trail was getting steeper, more technical, and I was riding faster than I should have been. 45 miles per hour on sections that really demanded 30 at most. My tires were skipping over roots, my suspension bottoming out on impacts. I wasn't riding clean anymore. I was just trying to put distance between myself and whatever I'd heard in the forest. Then I saw it. I was coming around a tight left-hand corner, leaned way over, probably doing 35 miles per hour, when my peripheral vision caught movement to my right. Something big, moving parallel to me through the trees. I didn't get a clear look, just an impression of size, of something massive and upright, keeping pace with me through the forest. My first thought was elk. Had to be elk. But elk don't move through dense underbrush at 35 miles per hour. They crash through it, breaking branches, making noise. This thing was moving silently, fluidly, like it was part of the forest itself. I pedaled harder, pushing my speed to nearly 50 miles per hour on a straight section. The wind was roaring in my ears, tears streaming from my eyes. My quads were burning with the effort. I risked a glance to my right. It was still there, still keeping pace, still moving through the forest parallel to the trail. That's when I knew, with absolute certainty, that I was being hunted. I don't know how else to describe the feeling. It wasn't like being chased by a dog or running from a bull. This was different. This was intelligent pursuit. Whatever was out there wasn't just reacting to my presence, it was actively tracking me, matching my speed, staying close but not revealing itself. The trail dropped into a series of switchbacks, sharp turns that forced me to slow down. I was braking hard into each corner, then accelerating out, trying to maintain as much speed as possible. My arms were aching from controlling the bike, my hands cramping from gripping the handlebars so tight. On the third switchback, I saw it clearly for the first time. It was standing at the corner of the turn, maybe 40 feet away, partially obscured by a massive cedar tree. I had maybe 2 seconds of clear line of sight before my momentum carried me past and down the trail. 2 seconds. But those 2 seconds burned themselves into my memory so completely that I can still see every detail when I close my eyes. It was at least 8 feet tall, maybe closer to 9, covered entirely in dark brown hair, matted and thick. The body was massively built, shoulders easily 3 feet across, arms that hung down past where human knees would be. The proportions were wrong for a human, wrong for a bear, wrong for anything I'd ever seen. But it was the face that froze my blood. It wasn't an aped face. It wasn't quite human either. Somewhere in between. And the brow ridge was heavy, the nose flat and broad. But the eyes were what got me. They were looking directly at me, tracking my movement, and there was intelligence there. Not animal intelligence, human intelligence. Maybe something beyond human intelligence. Those eyes weren't filled with aggression or hunger. They were calculating, studying, deciding. Then I was past the corner and speeding downhill again. My brain trying desperately to process what I'd just seen. Every rational explanation I'd ever used to dismiss Bigfoot sightings evaporated in those 2 seconds. This was real. It was here. And it was coming after me. The trail opened up into a faster section, and I pushed my bike to its absolute limit. 55 miles per hour, probably faster. The bike was shaking, the tires barely gripping, every rock and root threatening to throw me over the handlebars. I could hear it now, crashing through the forest to my right, no longer being stealthy. It sounded like a truck plowing through brush, branches snapping, something heavy hitting the ground with each stride. It was running now, really running, and it was getting closer. I came to a section where the trail narrowed, hemmed in by large boulders on both sides, a choke point. No room to maneuver, nowhere to go but straight through. I was halfway through when it appeared. It came from the uphill side, launching itself down toward the trail, landing on the path maybe 60 feet in front of me. It hit the ground hard, the impact so heavy I felt it through my bike tires. It was on all fours, but rising up, turning toward me. I had maybe 3 seconds before I would hit it at 50 miles per hour. Time seemed to slow down. I could see every detail, the way its muscles moved under the hair. The massive hands, fingers, easily twice as long as human fingers. The chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. And a face, still calm, still calculating. It wasn't trying to catch me, it was herding me. I made a split-second decision that probably saved my life. Instead of braking, instead of trying to turn, I aimed directly at it and pedaled harder. I've never believed in the concept of predator-prey dynamics until that moment. But something in my lizard brain understood that if I showed fear, if I tried to escape, I was prey. If I charged, if I acted like I was dangerous too, maybe it would reconsider. I was screaming as I rode at it. Not words, just a raw, primal yell. At the last possible second, it moved. It didn't jump away or scramble aside. It simply stepped off the trail, casually, like a person getting out of the way of a car. One moment it was blocking my path, the next it was standing 3 feet off the trail, watching me pass. I got another close look as I flew by. Less than 10 feet away this time. The smell hit me like a physical force. That musky, organic odor I'd noticed earlier, but amplified 1,000 times. My eyes watered from it. And then I was past, speeding away, not looking back, not thinking, just riding. The trail continued downward, twisting through the forest. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. I just rode, terror pushing me forward, adrenaline drowning out the pain in my legs and arms. After what felt like forever, but was probably only 5 minutes, the trail started to level out. I could see more light through the trees, meaning I was getting close to the lower elevation, closer to my truck. I risked a glance back. Nothing. The trail behind me was empty. But I didn't feel alone. I felt watched. The forest felt charged, electric with tension. I kept riding, slower now but still moving fast. My breathing was ragged, my heart hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. That's when I heard it again. That vocalization. That howl roar that made my bones vibrate. But this time it came from multiple directions, multiple voices. There was more than one. I stopped caring about my bike, about the footage, about everything, except getting out of there alive. The trail merged with an old logging road, and I followed it, pedaling as hard as my exhausted legs would allow. The sounds continued, calls and responses echoing through the forest, coming from different locations. They were communicating, coordinating. I was on their territory, and they were letting me know exactly how unwelcome I was. The logging road brought me back to the trailhead parking area. My truck sat exactly where I'd left it, looking like salvation. I threw my bike in the back, didn't bother securing it, just slammed the tailgate and jumped in the cab. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine turned over, and I've never been so grateful to hear that sound in my life. I reversed out of the parking spot, executed a quick 3-point turn, and started driving back down the logging road. Not fast enough to lose control, but as fast as I dared. In my rearview mirror, through the dust kicked up by my tires, I saw it. Standing at the edge of the tree line, partially hidden by shadow, was the same creature, watching me leave. Just standing there, motionless as I drove away. Then it raised one arm, slowly, deliberately. I don't know if it was waving goodbye or warning me never to come back. I didn't stop to find out. I drove straight through to the main highway, didn't stop until I reached a gas station 60 miles away. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for 30 minutes, just breathing, trying to process what had happened. My camera was still running when I finally thought to check it. Battery at 12%, but still recording. I had footage, I had evidence, I had proof. That should have made me feel better. It didn't, because in that moment, sitting in a gas station parking lot with autumn rain starting to fall, I realized something terrifying. I had just encountered something that wasn't supposed to exist. Something intelligent, powerful, and territorial. Something that had let me live, and I had no idea what to do with that information. I drove straight home that day, straight through. 7 hours, without stopping, except for gas and to use the bathroom. I lived in Portland at the time, in a small apartment in the Hawthorne district. My girlfriend Jennifer was there when I arrived, and she knew immediately that something was wrong. "David, you look like you've seen a ghost," she said. I told her I had a rough ride, took a bad fall, nothing serious, but I was shaken up. She accepted that. I went into our bedroom, closed the door and pulled out my laptop. I had to watch the footage. My hands were still shaking as I connected the camera and started downloading the files. The battery had died about 10 minutes after I reached my truck, but everything from the ride was there. Over an hour of footage. I started at the beginning. Me setting up at the trailhead, my voice on the audio saying something stupid about conquering Devil's Spine. How naive I sounded. How unaware of what was about to happen. The first footprint was there on camera, my hand beside it for scale. Even on my small laptop screen, you could see how massive it was. The ride footage was intense. You could see my speed, see the technical features I was hitting. Good stuff, exactly what my sponsor would want. Then came the section where I'd first heard the vocalization. My camera had picked it up. The audio was clear enough that I could hear every detail of that howl roar, could hear the subsonic rumble underneath it. I played it back 3 times, trying to find some explanation. Some way it could be a bear, a mountain lion, maybe even a person playing a prank with a recording. There was no explanation. The sound didn't match anything in any wildlife database or recording I could find online. Then came the footage of the creature on the trail. The camera angle wasn't perfect, and I was moving fast, so the image was blurred and shaky. But you could see it, dark brown, massive, standing in front of me. You could see the moment it stepped aside, see its shape, its movement. The footage ran for maybe 30 more seconds after that, mostly just the trail passing under my front wheel and the sound of my panicked breathing. I sat there staring at my computer screen for a long time. I had evidence. Real, tangible evidence of something that mainstream science said didn't exist. My first instinct was to upload it immediately, put it on YouTube, send it to news stations, contact wildlife researchers. This was huge. This would change everything. But something stopped me. I kept thinking about those eyes, the intelligence in them, the calm calculation. This wasn't just an animal I'd encountered. This was something else. Something that had let me live when it clearly could have stopped me. Over the next few days, I became obsessed. I couldn't think about anything else. I started researching everything I could find about Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest. There were thousands of reports going back over 100 years. Native American legends that describe these creatures as ancient guardians of the forest. Modern encounters from loggers, hikers, hunters. Most of it was obvious nonsense. Blurry photos that were clearly bears or people in costumes. Wild stories with no evidence. Attention seekers and hoaxers. But buried in all that noise were a few accounts that rang true. Reports from credible people, law enforcement officers, wildlife biologists, forestry workers. People who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by coming forward. Their descriptions matched what I'd seen. The size, the proportion, the way it moved, and especially the intelligence. One report in particular caught my attention. It was from 1997, written by a Forest Service ranger who had been working in the same general area where I'd had my encounter. He described finding evidence of something large and bipedal living in a system of caves on the north side of Mount Baker. He had documented massive footprints, shelters made from woven branches, and what he described as food caches containing the remains of deer and elk, arranged in a way that suggested deliberate storage. His report had been filed, then buried. When he pushed for a proper investigation, he was transferred to a different district. I managed to track him down. He was retired by then, living in Bellingham. His name was Frank Holloway, and when I called him, he was reluctant to talk at first. "Why do you want to know about this?" he asked. "Because I saw one," I said. "I have footage." There was a long silence on the other end. "Come see me," he finally said, "but don't bring your footage. Don't bring anything digital." I drove up to Bellingham the next weekend. Frank was in his late 60s, weathered and lean, with the kind of face that comes from spending most of your life outdoors. He invited me into his modest home, offered me coffee, and we sat at his kitchen table. "Show me your hands," he said. I held them out, confused. "You're a rider," he said, looking at my scarred knuckles and calloused palms. "Mountain biker?" I nodded. "And you saw one while you were riding? Fast enough that it chased you? How did you—" "Because that's their territory," he said, cutting me off. "Devil's Spine Trail, right? Or somewhere close to it." I just stared at him. Frank sighed and pulled out an old topographic map, spread it on the table. The Cascade Mountains were marked with red circles in several locations. "I spent 30 years with the Forest Service," he said. "And about 20 of those years, I was documenting something that officially doesn't exist. These red circles are areas of confirmed activity. Footprints, vocalizations, structures, encounters. There were dozens of circles. The area around Devil's Spine had 3 overlapping. They're territorial, Frank continued. They don't like intrusions, especially fast-moving ones. To them, you on that bike probably looked like prey running scared. It triggered a chase response. It didn't kill me, I said. It could have, but it didn't. No, Frank agreed. They don't typically attack humans unless severely threatened or protecting young. But they will chase you out of their territory. Make sure you know you're not welcome. He looked at me seriously. Did you bring your footage? You told me not to. Good. And you shouldn't show it to anyone else either. Why not? This is evidence. This proves they exist. Frank leaned back in his chair. You think you're the first person to have clear footage? You're not. There have been dozens over the years. High-quality photos, videos, audio recordings. You know what happens to most of them? I shook my head. They disappear. Or they're discredited so thoroughly that the person who took them becomes a laughingstock. Or, in a few cases, the people themselves disappear. That's conspiracy theory nonsense, I said. Is it? Frank pulled out a folder, thick with papers. These are reports I filed during my career. 17 separate incidents, all with physical evidence, plaster casts of tracks, hair samples, audio recordings. All of it documented according to proper protocol. He opened the folder, showed me page after page of official reports. Every single one was dismissed. Hair samples were contaminated, tracks were inconclusive, recordings were unclear. And when I kept pushing, I was reassigned, then reassigned again, until I finally got the message and shut up about it. But why? I asked. Why would anyone want to suppress this? Frank smiled, but it wasn't a happy expression. Think about it. Millions of acres of federal forest land in the Pacific Northwest. Logging operations, mining rights, recreation permits. All of that generates billions of dollars and provides thousands of jobs. He tapped one of the red circles on his map. Now imagine the federal government announces that an endangered species of large bipedal primate lives in these forests. What happens to all those logging operations? All that mining? Every timber company would be out of business overnight. The entire economy of the region would collapse. I hadn't thought about it that way. The government knows, Frank said quietly. Or at least, certain agencies know. And they've made a choice to keep it quiet. For economic reasons, for political reasons, maybe for reasons we don't even understand. He looked at me intently. So my advice to you is this: keep your footage private. Don't try to go back to that trail. And definitely don't try to prove anything to anyone. Because the only thing you'll accomplish is making your own life difficult. I left Frank's house that day with more questions than answers, but I took his advice seriously. Sort of. I didn't release the footage publicly, but I also couldn't just let it go. I started studying everything I could find about these creatures. Their behavior patterns, their habitat preferences, their social structure. I learned that they're primarily nocturnal, but occasionally active during dawn and dusk. I learned that they seem to migrate seasonally, moving to high elevations in summer and lower elevations in winter. I learned that they're likely omnivorous but prefer meat, and that they're sophisticated enough to use tools, build shelters, and possibly even have a form of language. Over the following months, I went back to the Cascades multiple times. Not to Devil's Spine, but to other areas that Frank had marked on his map. Areas where sightings were common, but human traffic was minimal. I never saw one again, not clearly. But I found evidence. Footprints in remote creek beds. Trees snapped at impossible heights. structures made from woven branches, and once a large pile of deer bones arranged in a circular pattern that I still don't have an explanation for. My girlfriend Jennifer started to worry about me. I was spending every weekend in the mountains, sometimes alone, sometimes with basic camping gear, sitting in the forest for hours, just observing. "You're becoming obsessed," she said one night. "This isn't healthy." She was right. But I couldn't stop. Something had fundamentally changed in me on that October day in 2004. I had encountered something that shouldn't exist, and it had rewired my brain. I stopped competing in races, let my sponsorship lapse, stopped posting on social media. My entire identity had been built around downhill racing, and suddenly it seemed trivial compared to what I'd experienced. By 2005, Jennifer had left me. Can't say I blame her. I had become distant, secretive, obsessed with something I couldn't fully explain, but I couldn't give it up, because I knew the truth. I'd seen it with my own eyes. These creatures were real, they were intelligent, and they were out there right now, living in the shadows of forests that millions of people drove past every day without a second thought. The breaking point came in September 2005, almost exactly a year after my original encounter. I had been hiking alone in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, about 60 miles south of Mount Baker. It was an area Frank had marked as having consistent activity, and I'd spent the previous 3 weekends exploring the region, finding nothing but ordinary forest. This particular weekend, I had gone deeper than before. I had a heavy-duty backpack with camping gear, enough food for 4 days, water purification tablets, and all the recording equipment I could carry. Digital camera, audio recorders, night vision scope that I'd bought off eBay. I was becoming what I had always dismissed as foolish, a Bigfoot hunter. But I preferred to think of myself as a researcher. I was documenting, observing, trying to understand. The first 2 days were uneventful. Beautiful forests, good weather, no signs of anything unusual. I hiked old logging roads, explored creek beds, checked areas where elk or deer might congregate. On the 3rd night, everything changed. I had set up camp in a small clearing near a stream, about 8 miles from the nearest Forest Service road. My tent was a simple 2-person affair, surrounded by tall cedars and Douglas firs. I had a small fire going, not for warmth, but because I'd read that fires might attract curious creatures. Around 10 p.m., the forest went silent. I recognized that silence immediately. Same feeling as before, like the air pressure had changed, like everything natural had fled and left me alone with something unnatural. I killed my fire and sat very still, listening. For about 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then I heard movement. Not the random sounds of an animal wandering through underbrush, but deliberate footsteps, heavy, slow, circling my campsite. Whatever it was walking upright. I could tell by the rhythm of the steps. Not the 4-beat pattern of a deer or the loping gait of a bear, but the 2-beat rhythm of something walking on 2 legs. I sat in my tent with my camera in hand, not turning on any lights, barely breathing. The footsteps continued circling, sometimes getting closer, sometimes moving away. This went on for over an hour. Then I heard it touch my tent. Just a light brush against the outside fabric, but enough to make the whole structure shudder. I froze, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. A long silence. Then another touch, this time more deliberate. Whatever was out there was testing the tent, seeing what it was, maybe trying to understand what I was. I heard breathing, deep, slow. incredibly powerful. Right outside the tent wall, maybe 2 feet from where I sat. Then came a smell. That same musky, organic odor from my encounter on the bike trail, but even stronger in the enclosed space of the tent. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to unzip the tent and sprint into the forest. But I knew that would be suicidal. If I ran, I was prey. If I stayed still, I was ... What? Not a threat, hopefully. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes. Then, slowly, the footsteps moved away from the tent. I heard them receding into the forest, getting fainter, until finally the normal night sounds of the forest return. Crickets, a far-off owl, wind in the trees. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back against my backpack, camera in hand, listening to every sound. When dawn broke, I packed up my camp faster than I'd ever packed anything in my life. I wanted out of there. But before I left, I looked around the perimeter of my campsite. There, pressed deep into the soft ground near where my tent had been, was a footprint. Just one, 18 inches long at least. Clear toe impressions, the same 5-toed pattern I'd seen before. It had been right there, right outside my tent, close enough to touch me through the fabric, and it had chosen not to. I took photos of the print, got measurements, then hiked out as fast as I could. By noon I was back in my truck. By evening I was home in Portland. That encounter should have scared me off permanently. Should have convinced me to stop pursuing this, to get back to normal life, to forget about the whole thing. Instead, it had the opposite effect. Because I realized something important. Whatever these creatures were, they had opportunities to harm humans and chose not to. They were territorial, yes. They would intimidate and frighten. But they weren't predators hunting people. They were intelligent beings trying to avoid contact, and I had been violating their space. Over the next few months, I became more careful. I learned to recognize signs that I was in active territory and learned when to back off. I started leaving small offerings, testing a theory I'd read about in Native American accounts. Food, simple tools, anything that might be interpreted as a peace offering. And slowly, carefully, I started to see patterns. There were certain areas that were clearly off limits. Regions where the density of evidence suggested these creatures had established permanent territories. Places they didn't want humans near. Other areas seemed to be more transient, places they passed through but didn't claim. I focused on the transition zones, the boundaries. That's where I had my next significant encounter. It was February 2006. I was hiking along a ridgeline in the Cascades, area that Frank had marked as having possible seasonal migration route. There was still snow on the ground at that elevation, maybe 6 inches, which made tracking much easier. I found a line of footprints in the snow, so fresh that the edges were still crisp. They were heading north along the ridge, the stride length suggesting the creature had been moving at a steady walk, not rushing. I followed them for about 2 miles, staying far enough back that I wouldn't overtake whatever had made them, but close enough that I wouldn't lose the trail. The prints led to a rocky outcropping that formed a natural shelter, almost like a shallow cave. And there, in the snow in front of this shelter, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a pile of branches, deliberately arranged, and sitting on top of that pile was my camera lens cap. The lens cap I had lost 3 months earlier, 30 miles away, in a completely different part of the forest. They knew who I was, they knew what I was doing, and they were sending me a message. I stood there in the snow, staring at that lens cap as the full weight of the situation hit me. These weren't just intelligent creatures. They were tracking me as much as I was tracking them. They knew my routines, knew my equipment, knew where I went. And they had chosen to return something to me. Not as a threat, but as, what? Acknowledgement, communication. I picked up the lens cap slowly, half expecting something to emerge from the rocks. Nothing did. The forest was quiet, not the threatening silence from before, but something more neutral, watchful but not hostile. I set down the chocolate bar I'd been planning to eat for lunch, placed it carefully on the pile of branches where the lens cap had been. An exchange, an offering for an offering. Then I backed away, walked back the way I'd come, and didn't look back. If you're still with me on this story, and that spine is really tingling now, hit that subscribe button. It helps us bring more accounts like this that you won't hear anywhere else. And tell me in the comments, if you had found your lost item returned to you in the middle of the wilderness, would you have stayed to see what happened next? Or would you have run? The real turning point came in July 2006, and it had nothing to do with me seeking them out. They came to me. I was living in a different apartment by then, on the outskirts of Portland, closer to the forest. I'd been more and more drawn to spend time in the mountains, often just sitting and observing, trying to understand the patterns of life in areas where these creatures lived. But this particular weekend, I wasn't in the forest. I was home, recovering from a minor knee injury I'd gotten on a trail ride. Nothing serious, but enough that I was taking it easy for a few days. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up to a sound outside my apartment. I lived on the ground floor of a small complex that backed onto a wooded area, basically the transition zone where suburban developments met forest. My bedroom window faced those woods, and I'd always liked falling asleep to the sound of wind in the trees. The sound that woke me wasn't wind. It was the same vocalization I'd heard on Devil's Spine Trail. That howl roar that was unmistakable once you'd heard it. But quieter this time, more controlled. Almost like it was trying not to wake the whole neighborhood. I got out of bed slowly, went to the window, and looked out. There, standing at the edge of the tree line, maybe 50 feet from my apartment, was one of them. It wasn't the same one I'd encountered on the bike trail. This one looked slightly smaller, maybe 7.5 feet tall instead of 9. The fur was darker, almost black in the dim light from the parking lot security lamps. And it was looking directly at my window. At me. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then it raised one hand, palm out, in what I can only describe as a gesture of ... peace, recognition. Then it turned and walked back into the forest, moving silently despite its size. I stood at that window for the rest of the night, but it didn't return. In the morning, I went out to where it had been standing. No footprints. The ground was too hard and dry. But there was something else. Arranged in a small pile were items I had lost or left behind during my various trips into the forest over the past year. A water bottle I'd forgotten at a campsite. A carabiner that had fallen off my backpack. Even a notebook I'd been writing observations in that I'd thought was lost forever. They had been collecting my things, keeping track of me, and now they were returning them. The message was clear. We know who you are. We know where you live. We've been watching you just as much as you've been watching us. I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt something else. Honored, maybe. Or humbled. These creatures could have harmed me at any point. They could have destroyed my equipment, could have made it impossible for me to continue my observations. Instead, they had chosen to communicate. I spent the next few weeks trying to process what had happened, I talked to Frank again, told him about the encounter near my apartment. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. "They're taking a risk," he finally said, "coming that close to human habitation. They must have a reason." "What reason?" "I don't know. Maybe they're trying to tell you something. Maybe they recognize that you're different from other humans, that you're trying to understand rather than exploit." He looked at me seriously. "Or maybe they're warning you. Maybe something is about to happen and they want you to know." 2 weeks later, I found out what Frank meant. I was hiking in the same area where I'd found my lens cap, the rocky outcropping that had seemed like one of their shelters. But this time, when I arrived, the place had been destroyed. Trees had been cut down, heavy equipment had torn up the ground, and there was a new road being bulldozed through the area. Development. Someone had bought the land and was preparing to build vacation homes. I stood there looking at the destruction, and I felt something I'd never experienced before: genuine rage on behalf of another species. This was their territory, their home, and it was being torn apart for summer cabins that would sit empty 10 months out of the year. I made a decision in that moment, a decision that would define the next 15 years of my life. I was going to do everything I could to protect their territory, even if I couldn't reveal why it needed protection. Over the following years, I became an activist. I joined environmental groups, attended county planning meetings, opposed every development project I could in areas where I knew these creatures lived. I couldn't tell anyone the real reason. I couldn't show my footage or explain my encounters, but I could fight using the tools available to me: environmental protection laws, endangered species regulations, land conservation efforts. I became known as that guy who always opposed development in the Cascades. Some people called me a radical environmentalist. Others accused me of trying to kill jobs and hurt the economy. But slowly, incrementally, I started to make a difference. I helped block several major development projects. I worked with conservation groups to purchase land that would remain protected. I documented environmental impacts that forced companies to abandon plans. And through it all, I continued my observations in the forest. The encounters became rarer as I got older and less mobile, but they never stopped it entirely. The creatures seemed to understand what I was trying to do. There were small signs, difficult to explain to anyone who hadn't experienced them. Paths that seemed to clear themselves overnight. Evidence of their presence left specifically where it would support environmental impact arguments. Once, a perfectly preserved footprint appeared in a creek bed right before a critical survey that helped block a logging operation. They were working with me in their own way, protecting their territory through me, since they couldn't do it themselves. But there was a cost. The cost of keeping this secret, of dedicating my life to protecting something I could never publicly acknowledge, was higher than I expected. By 2010, I had lost most of my friends. My family thought I'd lost my mind, trading a promising career as a professional athlete for what they saw as unemployed environmental activism. My parents stopped inviting me to holidays after I spent Thanksgiving 2008 at a planning commission meeting instead of at their dinner table. I worked odd jobs to pay rent, construction work, bike shop repairs, whatever I could find that let me take time off for my real work in the mountains. I was essentially alone. No romantic relationships, no close friends, just me and my obsession with protecting territory for creatures that most people thought were mythical. There were nights when I questioned everything. Nights when I'd look at my old racing photos, remember what it felt like to be sponsored and successful and normal, and wonder if I'd made a terrible mistake. But then I'd go back to the forest, and I'd find evidence that they were still there, still surviving, still living their lives in the shadows, protected by the work I was doing, and that made it worthwhile. The last time I saw one clearly was in 2015, 11 years after my initial encounter on Devil's Spine Trail. I was 43 years old by then. My knees were shot from years of downhill racing and hiking rough terrain, and I'd recently been diagnosed with early onset arthritis. My days of long backcountry expeditions were behind me, but I still made short trips when I could. Easy trails, day hikes, nothing too demanding. I was hiking near Mount Baker, actually not far from Devil's Spine Trail, though I'd never been back to that specific location. It was late afternoon in September, the light coming through the trees at that perfect golden angle. I stopped to rest at a small clearing, sitting on a fallen log, drinking water from my bottle. That's when I saw it emerge from the tree line across the clearing. It was massive, probably 9 feet tall, with dark brown fur that showed traces of gray. Old. This was an old one. I could tell by the way it moved, careful and deliberate, not the powerful stride of a younger creature. It walked into the clearing, stopped about 30 feet from me, and just stood there. We looked at each other. I could see details I'd never noticed before. The intelligence in the eyes, yes, but also something else. Weariness, maybe. Or sadness. Like this creature had seen too much, lived too long, experienced too many intrusions into its world. Slowly, moving with deliberate care so as not to startle it, I reached into my backpack and pulled out an apple. I'd taken to carrying fresh fruit on my hikes, sometimes leaving it as offerings. I held up the apple so it could see, then gently tossed it across the distance between us. It landed in the grass about halfway between us. The creature looked at the apple, then back at me. Then it did something that still brings tears to my eyes when I think about it. It reached up with one massive hand and touched its chest, right over where a human heart would be. Then it extended that hand toward me, palm out. The gesture was universal. Gratitude, acknowledgement, respect. Then it picked up the apple, turned, and walked back into the forest. I sat on that log for another hour, just processing what had happened. That moment of connection, creature to human, acknowledgement of everything I'd been trying to do for the past decade. It was validation, proof that my sacrifices had meant something. I haven't seen one since then. My health has declined to the point where I can't do the kind of hiking necessary to reach their territories. I live in a small house now, closer to Portland, with a view of Mount Hood from my kitchen window, but I still fight for their protection. Now I do it through donations to conservation groups, through written testimonies at planning meetings, through teaching younger activists about the importance of preserving old-growth forest habitat. I've never told anyone the real reason why, not even Frank, who passed away in 2018. He went to his grave knowing the truth, having spent decades trying to protect these creatures through official channels before being silenced. My footage from that day on Devil's Spine Trail still exists. It's on an old hard drive in my closet, encrypted, password protected. I've thought about releasing it thousands of times, but every time I consider it, I remember what Frank said. The only thing I would accomplish is making my own life difficult. And more importantly, I would be violating the trust that these creatures placed in me. They've let me live, let me observe them, communicated with me in their own way. The least I can do is respect their desire to remain hidden, because here's what I've learned over the past 20 years. They don't want to be discovered. They're not hiding out of fear. They're maintaining a choice. They could reveal themselves anytime they wanted, but they've seen what humans do to things we discover, how we exploit and commercialize and destroy. They're choosing to remain in the shadows, and I'm choosing to help them do that. The forest is quieter now than it was 20 years ago. More roads, more development, more human intrusion into wild spaces. I don't know how much longer they can maintain their secrecy, but I'll keep fighting to protect their territory for as long as I can, even if I never see one again. Even if no one ever knows the real reason why. Some truths are more important kept secret than revealed. So why am I telling this story now, after 20 years of silence? I'm 52 years old. The arthritis that started in my knees has spread to my hips and spine. I have maybe another 10-15 years if I'm lucky, and probably not all of them will be good years. I've spent 2 decades protecting a secret that weighs heavier every year. And I've realized something. The secret itself is less important than what it represents. There are things in this world that science hasn't explained yet. Things that live in the margins, in the spaces between what we know and what we think we know. And just because we haven't catalogued them, haven't studied them, haven't put them in textbooks, doesn't mean they don't exist. I'm not releasing my footage. I'm not revealing specific locations. I'm not giving anyone a treasure map to go find these creatures. But I am saying this. They're real. They're intelligent. They're out there right now, in forests across the Pacific Northwest and probably beyond. They're watching us just as much as we occasionally glimpse them, and they deserve to be left alone. If this story does anything, I hope it makes one person think twice before supporting another development project that tears up old-growth forest. I hope it makes someone question whether we really need to log every last acre, mine every last resource, build vacation homes in every last wild space. Because we're not alone on this planet. We never have been. And some of our neighbors prefer to keep their distance. I think about that day on Devil's Spine Trail often. About the choice I made to keep riding downhill instead of turning back. About the creature that could have stopped me but chose to let me pass. I think about the night it came to my apartment, returning the things I'd lost. About the old one that touched its chest in that clearing in 2015. These weren't random encounters with mindless animals. These were communications with intelligent beings who were trying to coexist with us while maintaining their own space, their own way of life. The biggest regret of my life isn't giving up my racing career. It's not the relationships I lost or the normal life I could have had. My biggest regret is that I couldn't do more, that I couldn't protect more of their territory, that I couldn't stop all the development, all the logging, all the human intrusion into their world. But I did what I could, and I'll keep doing what I can for as long as I'm able. My hope is that someday, maybe long after I'm gone, we'll reach a point where we can acknowledge these creatures without destroying them, where we can coexist openly instead of them having to hide. But I'm not optimistic. I've seen how humans react to things we don't understand. Fear, exploitation, commercialization. Turn them into theme park attractions or hunting trophies or government experiments. Maybe it's better they stay hidden. Maybe that's the kindest thing we can do for them. Pretend they don't exist, leave their forests alone, and let them live in peace. I've told you my story not to prove anything, but to share a truth. The world is bigger and stranger than we're taught. There are mysteries in the mountains, intelligence in the forests, and beings that exist just outside our normal perception. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, or very unlucky depending on how you look at it, you get to encounter one of those mysteries. What you do with that encounter defines you. I chose to protect. Others might choose differently. But if you ever find yourself on a trail in the Cascade Mountains and the forest goes suddenly completely silent, pay attention. You might not be alone. And whatever is watching you from the shadows is probably intelligent enough to let you pass safely, as long as you show respect. That's all they've ever asked for. Respect and space to exist. It's not much to ask, but somehow we keep failing to give it to them. If this story made you look at the forest in a different way, subscribe to this channel now so you don't miss the next accounts. And before you go, choose one of the stories appearing on your screen. Each one holds a secret as disturbing as this one. Thanks for watching, and remember, some truths prefer to stay in the shadows. But sooner or later, they find someone willing to tell them.